A stillness had settled over our Christmas until a single cry shattered it. In the kitchen of our Rochester home, my wife hummed along with the radio, and our home was filled with that particular holiday emptiness, the kind that echoes when your children are grown and have Christmases of their own. At first I dismissed the thin wail as wind against the siding, but it returned higher, more raw this time, a fractured sound that no winter storm could make. When I opened the front door, the cold surged in, as if it had been lying in wait. I just stood there, letting it wash over me. A 67-year-old man in his worn slippers, just listening. It wasn't a baby and it wasn't a fox. It was something smaller, something terrified. A third cry pierced the air, guiding me towards the abandoned Miller property to our left. A small, dark gap in the dilapidated fence marked the space between our yards. I found myself shuffling toward it, my hand gripping the porch rail, that desperate sound pulling me deeper into the cold than I ever intended to go. And through that gap, my eyes fell upon her. A German shepherd pup, no more than 5 months old, her tiny legs swallowed by the deep snow. A heavy chain tethered her collar to a metal stake in the ground. There was no doghouse, no blanket for warmth, only a frozen plastic bowl, and a small body trembling so violently her ears shook. In my time, I've seen factories shutter their windows for good. I've watched holiday lights blink over the porches of homes long since abandoned. But the sound of that persistent cry erupting from such a tiny chest into the unforgiving air sliced into me deeper than any of it. It was then she saw me. A faint, hopeful twitch of her tail. Her dark, glistening eyes locked with mine wide with a single, unspoken question. My hand tightened on the railing as I took one deliberate step toward that broken fence. In that instant, she lifted her head, the chain clinking softly in the silence, and she looked directly into my soul, as if she knew this was the moment someone had finally come. My own body was the first thing to protest. The moment I leaned over that weary old fence, a sharp complaint shot through my back. But that little life in the snow had no concern for my age or my ailments. Up close, she seemed even more fragile. The chain was cruelly short, offering her barely enough room to turn. The snow was packed into a hard, desperate circle from what must have been days of pacing her frozen prison. Her metal bowl held nothing but a solid block of ice. And the puppy herself? She was shivering so intensely that her entire small frame quaked with the effort. Her eyes squeezed shut against the relentless wind. I could feel the cold sinking its teeth into my own fingers, but it was the sound of her breathing that truly alarmed me. It was rapid, shallow, the ragged gasps of a life desperately trying to hold on. But I have nothing left. My voice was a raw whisper. Just hold on. I didn't know if I was pleading with her or with myself. I made my way back to the house, each step a heavy effort, my hand gripping the icy railing. My wife was there, framed by the kitchen window. With her arms crossed, she watched me the way you watch a man foolishly attempting a task beyond his strength. The moment I came inside, the sudden warmth clouded my glasses. "You aren't trying to rescue the entire world out there, are you?" she asked. "We can hardly manage our own grocery bill." "I'm just giving her some water," I managed to say, the words sounding hollow and frail even to me. I filled a bowl with warm water from the tap and scraped our leftover chicken and rice onto a plate. She let out a long, weary sigh and then reached for a small towel. "Put this on the steps," she murmured. "I don't need you ending up flat on your back over one slip." Stepping outside again, the biting cold was a shock, but the memory of that creature's violent trembling struck me even harder. I carefully placed the towel on the top step, then moved toward the gap in the fence, cradling the bowl like a fragile offering. "Easy now, sweetheart," I whispered, setting the food and water just within the limit of her chain. "I'm not going to hurt you." For a tense moment, she was perfectly still, as if fearing that this kindness was just another cruel trick. Then her nose twitched. She took one hesitant step, then another, her entire body quaking until she reached the bowl and drank with a desperate urgency as if the world might disappear at any second. I told myself it was only to get her through the cold spell. Just for one day, maybe two. Just enough to stop the weather from finishing the cruel work that people had started. I walked back to the house, a profound weight settling upon my soul. I closed the door softly, the latch clicking shut, and for a single heartbeat, the familiar quiet of our home was restored. But then that same desolate cry rose up from the darkness of the yard, piercing the walls as if she were calling directly to me, questioning why I would ever leave her there alone. We began to tolerate her cries, the way you tolerate a clock ticking in an empty room. At first, the sound sliced through our home like a knife, but after a few days had passed, it simply dissolved into the background noise of winter in Rochester, New York. On the calendar by the refrigerator, my wife began to draw small, meticulous dots on each passing day. One dot for every day we delivered food and warm water to that German shepherd puppy beyond the fence. Before long, a crooked line of paw prints appeared, a path of unspoken promises we never intended to forge. There were mornings she'd go in my place, bundled tightly in that worn old coat of hers, grumbling that her knees were bothering her less than mine. She'd return cheeks flushed red, insisting the dog had eaten every bite, even as she trembled. We never gave the dog a name. We simply called her she, as if the universe itself should understand our meaning. Then from time to time, a truck would rumble into that desolate driveway. A man would emerge, hurl something in the direction of the bowl, and be gone before the engine even had a chance to cool. He never knelt down, never uttered a word. Sometimes he wouldn't even cast a glance her way. Witnessing that stirred a bitterness in my gut that time could never soothe. At night, as the house grew still and the pipes groaned, my mind would conjure the image of another dog. Back when I was a boy in a quiet town, a scruffy mutt used to wait for me just outside the school. Rain or shine, he was there by that cracked step. No one ever asked him to. He simply decided I was his responsibility. On the hardest days, when the yelling inside my home would erupt before I'd even managed to take off my shoes, he would lean his body against my leg and guide me all the way to the creek, as if he knew I desperately needed a quieter kind of peace. I thought of that loyal old friend every time this little one edged a bit closer. In the beginning, she'd grab the food and recoil, her chain clanking with the sudden movement. Then ever so slowly she started to linger near the fence, her head tilted in curiosity, listening as I stood there speaking of simple things. The weather, the neighbors, how the snow was piling up higher this year. She couldn't have understood the words, but she knew the tenderness in my voice was just for her. On most evenings, I would sit at our kitchen table as my wife knitted quietly in her chair by the window. Holiday lights from the street cast soft-colored glows upon the glass. Beyond our own yard, in the shadowed expanse of the miller's property, I could just make out her form against the snow, a dark, huddled shape against the stark white, forever chained, forever waiting. The television droned on some bright host discussing holiday getaways, and just then the weatherman's voice turned grave. "The coldest Christmas we've had in years," he announced. "Life-threatening wind chills. Stay indoors if at all possible." My gaze shifted from the screen to the window to that tiny shadow in the yard next door. The heavy chain, the desolate bowl, the heartbreaking way she tried to curl into herself, seeking a warmth that wasn't there. "She's not going to make it," I heard my own voice whisper. And suddenly the rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall became a deafening countdown, drowning out her fading cries. The older you become, the more sorrows you learn to carry. But you never learn to bear the sound of a living soul shivering alone in the darkness. That evening, after the forecast promised a historic cold front, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, phone in hand for longer than I'm proud to admit. With a heavy heart, I finally punched in the animal control number from a faded magnet clinging to our refrigerator door. A measured, professional voice answered. I explained the situation with the German shepherd puppy next door. The chain, the bowl, frozen solid, the way her whimpers grew sharper every time the wind howled. I fought to keep my voice even, but it broke every time I uttered the word chained. "We have the address logged," she informed me. "We're fielding a lot of calls with this cold snap moving in. We will do our best to dispatch someone as soon as possible." As soon as possible. Words meant for people who still had time to spare. I murmured my thanks and ended the call, a wave of uselessness washing over me instead of relief. My wife placed a warm mug of tea before me. "You made the call," she said, her voice a soft reassurance. "That is something." "But it isn't enough," I replied, the words tasting like ash. "We did what we could," she told me gently. "We aren't 20 anymore. We can no longer fix the entire world." I didn't have the strength to argue, but the image of that small body huddled in the snow was burned into my mind. When we lay in bed, the warmth of our house felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the bitter cold just outside our walls. The disparity made it feel difficult to draw a full breath. The wind picked up later that night, screaming around the corners of the house as if settling an ancient score. I lay there wide awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, my mind drifting back to another winter. The first Christmas after the factory shut down, when I returned home with only a cardboard box of my tools and no words to explain our future to the children. We had next to nothing that year. The furnace struggled to keep up, the stack of bills grew ever higher, and some nights the only source of warmth in our home was the little dog pressed faithfully against our feet beneath the blankets. She was a tiny thing, nothing special to look at, but she was the one who kept the chill from seeping deep into our bones. Looking back, I believe she held our family together with the simple, steady rhythm of her breathing. I rose from the bed and found the old photo box in the hall, and there we were, the children so small, then their faces glowing in the light of the tree. That old dog of ours sprawled out under the coffee table like she reigned over the whole house. In those days, I was sure the years ahead would be a wonderful, chaotic symphony. But now the silence in this house was a physical weight, and a puppy shivered just 1 yard from me, as if all that warmth had been just a dream. By morning, the cold had a different edge, a brittle quality, as though the very air might fracture. I threw on my coat and stepped into the freeze, each breath hanging in front of me like a ghost. The snow groaned under my boots as I made my way to the broken fence. She was still there, that same fragile body, but now a terrifying stillness had settled over her. Clumps of snow were frozen into her fur, crusted like jewels around her small collar. Her chain was seized by the ice, tethered to a stake that looked as if it had been welded to the frozen earth. For a long, agonizing second, I couldn't see her chest move. It was in that moment the thought came, sharp and undeniable. If I wait for someone else to step in, I will be too late. Sometimes getting older doesn't afford you the time to deliberate. You just wake up one day, you see what the world is presenting you, and you realize in your bones that if you don't act now, the moment will be lost forever. I tried animal control again. The same sequence of numbers, the same cold plastic against my fingers. This time I wasn't even connected to a person, just a pre-recorded voice wishing me a happy holiday before asking me to leave a message. I left my name or address there in Rochester, and the words, "German Shepherd puppy chained barely moving." But my own voice sounded faint, as if it already knew nobody was coming. When I put the phone down, I saw my wife watching me from her chair by the window. We didn't speak for a time. We just listened to the relentless wind pressing against the glass, a mournful sound. "If we don't do something," I finally whispered, "we're going to see that spot in the snow for the rest of our lives and know what we let happen." She closed her eyes, a flicker of pain crossing her face, then she opened them and gave me a single firm nod. "Get your coat," she commanded softly. "Wine. I'll find the old blanket." From the garage, I took the rusted wire cutters off their hook, the ones I hadn't touched since I mended the garden fence. She emerged with a heavy wool blanket, one that had kept our own children warm when they were small. We stepped into the storm together. Her hand found my arm, a small anchor to steady us both. The cold bit into us with a vengeance as we crossed into the neighbor's yard. Up close, the puppy seemed impossibly fragile against the stark white snow. Her fur a delicate crust of ice, her eyes dimmed with despair, yet fixed on our every move. We spoke in hushed, steady tones, the way you would to a terrified child desperate not to break what little spirit remained. "Hey there, little one," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "We're here. We're getting you out of this." With a strength she barely possessed, her head began to rise. Her tail managed the faintest, most exhausted flicker, a sign she wanted to believe our promise, but wasn't sure if she dared to hope. My eyes fell upon the desperate circle worn into the snow, where she had paced endlessly, the heavy chain gouging a deep wound into the frozen earth. There was no fresh straw, no semblance of shelter, only the chilling testament to how long she had been utterly forgotten. I knelt as low as my aching knees would permit, my hand closing over the frigid metal link by her collar. If anyone tried to stop me now, as the cold burned deep into my palm, I knew with absolute certainty that I would not let go. That final snap of the chain falling into the snow echoed louder than any cathedral bell. It was only a faint clink and a muffled thud. But in that moment it felt as if the entire world held its breath. The last link yielded to the cutters, and for a heart-stopping second there was only silence. The little German shepherd remained motionless, her head bowed, as if her spirit hadn't yet received the news her body was finally free. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. "You're not tied anymore." She took a single, faltering step, and then another, testing her newfound liberty. I braced myself, expecting her to bolt for the open world she had stared at for 20 long days. But instead, her fragile legs gave way. She simply crumpled against my knees, a fragile weight of bone and frozen fur, placing all her silent trust in me, as if pouring the last of her life force into mine. The cutters fell from my grasp as I fumbled to slide the blanket beneath her, my fingers numb and awkward in the biting cold. This old wool blanket had once shielded our own children through countless winter nights. Now it embraced this trembling little body, as if its purpose had simply been waiting. My wife knelt, her joints protesting, and carefully tucked the edges around the puppy's paws. "Oh, you poor, sweet girl," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion on the final word. And for the first time, the puppy responded with more than a whimper. She raised her muzzle a mere inch and offered the faintest, most hesitant lick against my wife's wrist. It was a silent acknowledgement, as if to say she had heard every gentle word, every promise we'd whispered to her through that cold, cruel fence. We moved her with painstaking care to the car, my muscles burning from the strain, yet my heart felt inexplicably buoyant. My wife held the doors, her hands fluttering over the blanket, sealing every gap against the biting wind. On the desperate drive to the clinic, the frozen world outside became a streak of white and gray. But inside our small car, all that mattered was the faint, returning warmth from the fragile life I held. Her breathing, once a panicked, shallow gasp, gradually deepened into a steadier, calmer rhythm against my own chest. My own heart hammered against my ribs with a force that felt almost shameful, a frantic drumbeat of hope and fear. The moment we crossed the threshold of the clinic, the veterinarian's gaze shifted from the puppy cradled in my arms to our weary faces, absorbing our unspoken plea in a single profound look. He placed a gentle hand on her tiny body, listened intently, then met my eyes and said in a low voice, "She's a fighter. She'll pull through. But what happens after this? That responsibility is going to fall to you." The most haunting thing about an old person's home isn't the quiet. It's how swiftly you become accustomed to it. They held the little German shepherd at the clinic for 2 agonizing days, slowly coaxing warmth back into her, tending to her frost-bitten skin, and ensuring her heart and lungs were strong enough to carry her into the future. The vet spoke of IV fluids, constant monitoring, and figures on charts. We could only nod because we possessed none of the right questions. Only this overwhelming, undeniable feeling. When we emerged back into the parking lot without her, my arms ached with a sudden, profound emptiness. That old wool blanket lay on the back seat, holding the faint outline of where she had rested. At home, the house seemed to yawn open and swallow us again. My wife set 2 cups of tea on the table, just as she always did. Steam rose into the silent space between us, and nothing else dared to stir. Somehow the blanket found its way onto the arm of my chair, an unspoken memorial. I could still catch her scent on it. Not the acrid smell of a shelter, just the lingering notes of cold and terror, and a soul so young it hadn't yet been given a chance to be anything else. That night, I lay in bed listening with an intensity you reserve for a sound you're not sure you heard. Except this time I was listening for the absence of one. No rasp of a chain, no fragile whimper seeping through the cracks around the windows. One might assume that would make sleep come easier. It did not. Instead, my mind drifted backward to our first Christmas in this house, back when the paint was fresh and our bones didn't ache so much. A tree once stood in that corner, its frame askew, but its lights blazing, and the living room floor was a sea of torn wrapping paper and the blur of tiny racing feet. Our son, I remember, had drifted to sleep on the rug, his face tucked into the fur of our old dog, her tail a soft, rhythmic beat against the floor as the lights blinked over them both. The sound of life in this house felt infinite then. I recall escaping to the hallway, needing a moment just to breathe, overwhelmed by the sheer force of all that joy. Now these same walls bear witness to two elderly figures moving with quiet deliberation from one chair to the next. The only new sounds the steady tick of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. All that history, and yet it felt as if something was profoundly missing, as if we were strangers in our own home. We were nearing the end of our tea when the telephone's ring tore through the stillness. My wife answered, her expression shifting as she listened. Then she placed it on speaker for me to hear. "This is the clinic," a compassionate voice said. "She's stable. She's a true fighter. But we're facing a critical shortage of space through the holidays. May I pose a rather difficult question to you both? There are some questions you feel the answer to in your bones long before they're ever spoken." The woman on the line paused, clearing her throat. "With this cold front and the holiday rush, our kennels are completely full," she explained. "We were hoping, would you even consider bringing the German Shepherd puppy home? At least as a temporary foster, just to keep her from spending Christmas alone in a cold cage." My immediate gut reaction was to refuse. My knees already groaned like tired old floorboards every time I stood. The rattle of my blood pressure medication was a louder jingle than my car keys. A young dog, especially a German Shepherd, is no small undertaking. What happens if our time runs out before hers does? The question escaped my lips before I could restrain it. The words, my own words, hung between us like a frozen breath in the winter air. After the call ended, my wife and I sat at the kitchen table, bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lamp. No music, no television. Only the drone of the fridge and the weight of that question between us. "We're too old for a puppy," she finally whispered, her gaze fixed on her hands. "We can't give her the long walks she deserves. We'd be tripping over her toys. You know how you despise getting up in the night. And what if one of us ends up in the hospital?" I could only nod, for every single word she spoke was the undeniable truth. My own body had been telling me we were finished with such grand responsibilities. We had earned our peace. But after a pause, she added, "Do you remember the way she surrendered into my wrist when you finally cut that chain?" Her voice was a whisper. There was no fight in her. She just entrusted her entire being to us. "As if she knew we were her only hope. Remember when you declared we were too old for a cat?" She added, a faint smile touching her lips. "That was 20 years ago. And yet we somehow ended up feeding every stray in the neighborhood." We wrestled with the thought for what felt like an eternity. We listed the reasons we shouldn't, followed by memories of every creature that had found its way into our lives regardless. There was the fear of loving something we knew we'd eventually have to lose, eclipsed only by the greater fear of doing nothing and having to live with the silence. "Maybe we don't have 20 years, I finally conceded. "But we have this Christmas, and for her, all that matters is right now." As if the very house was waiting for those words, a sudden chime from the doorbell broke the stillness. Our eyes met for a long moment before we moved towards the front hall. A volunteer from the clinic stood on our porch. His shoulders were lightly dusted with snow, and in his hands he held a carrier. Inside, a puppy with a tiny red Christmas scarf was curled on a blanket. "I thought," he said it with a gentle tone, "the decision might be easier if you could look her in the eyes." The first night was a lesson in itself. She had no concept of what a home was supposed to be. We brought the carrier inside and carefully unlatched the door. But the little German shepherd remained curled on her blanket, staring up at us, as if waiting for this kindness to be revoked. When she finally emerged, placing one tentative paw down at a time, she tested the carpet as if expecting it to vanish beneath her. She moved with a haunting slowness, her body free of the chain, but her gait still burdened by its phantom weight around her neck. Her nose delicately explored the air, deciphering the scent of aged wood-clean laundry, and the warm stew my wife had simmering on the stove. A floorboard groaned, and she flinched violently, only to relax as my wife's hand came to rest with impossible gentleness on her shoulder. Her fingers disappeared into the matted fur. We drew a quiet, shallow bath of warm water, knowing that coaxing her in would require patience and murmured assurances. But the moment the warmth seeped into her skin, the most violent of her tremors ceased. We gently washed away the caked-on dirt and ice one small section at a time. And through it all, she just stood there blinking, as if discovering for the first time that compassion could exist for more than a fleeting moment. In the heart of our kitchen, we set down a clean bowl on a worn mat beside the table. She ate with such careful, tiny bites, her eyes lifting to us after each one, always ready to bolt if we so much as moved for the bowl. But we never did. We just watched her two old souls in worn-out slippers, feeling a quiet peace settle within us with every last morsel she consumed. But that night after the house fell into darkness, a whimper carried from the adjoining room. It was barely there, a thin, broken sound, as if the memory of a chain was still cinched tight around her, even in sleep. I rose from my bed more times than my aching back could stand, sinking to the floor beside her. I just sat there, letting her lean her full weight against my leg, until the frantic rhythm of her breathing finally softened. It was on one of those trips, bone-tired and sore, that I found myself whispering to her in the stillness of the dark. "You need a name," I murmured. "It's impossible to save a life you can't even call to." And then a word I'd read long ago drifted back into my memory. Leora. It had something to do with light. "You came into our lives like a sliver of light on the absolute coldest day," I whispered. "Let's call you Leora." Just then, morning began to seep through the curtains, all gray and soft. And when I swung my own feet to the floor, they brushed against something warm. And there she was. Leora stretched out right beside my bed, her head gently resting on my old house shoe, finally lost in a deep, quiet sleep, as if she'd decided in the depths of the night that this place could truly be her own. We thought we were saving her from the bitter cold. It turns out the physical cold is nothing compared to the memories that freeze a soul from the inside out. In the days that followed her arrival, Leora slowly began to look more like the German shepherd puppy she was, and less like a fleeting shadow. She ate with a growing confidence, and one afternoon even trotted down the hallway with a toy in her mouth, the first we'd seen, as if the simple joy of play had finally found an open door to her heart. But certain sounds still had the power to fracture something deep inside her. The sharp clang of a metal hanger slipping in the closet would make her freeze eyes wide with terror, her tail tucked so tightly it nearly vanished. If a door slammed shut by mistake, she'd release a single sharp bark, before scrambling to find any place to hide her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, her heart hammering against the floor. Then one afternoon, just a few days shy of New Year's, some kids from down the block were in their yard with those silly, cheap poppers, just innocent little things of paper and powder. We could hear their laughter as they pulled the strings, their tiny reports echoing against the snow-covered ground. The very first pop ripped through the air, and Leora was simply gone. By the time I reached the kitchen, she had wedged herself beneath the table, pressed flush against the wall, trembling so violently her nails tapped a frantic rhythm against the tile. Her chest rose and fell in ragged bursts, her eyes lost in a place I couldn't see, as if she had been violently pulled back to that frozen yard. I knew that stare intimately. It was the same one I wore as a boy, hidden in the darkness of a closet, while angry voices escalated the same shadow that fell when certain sounds resurrected ghosts I'd fought to keep buried. The body keeps a score the mind desperately tries to erase, and so I did the only thing I could imagine doing. With protesting bones, I slid down onto the cold kitchen floor and stretched myself out right beside her. I didn't try to touch her. Not at first. I just lay there, my voice a low murmur breaking the terrible silence. It was as if I was telling a bedtime story meant to soothe us both. I told her about what it felt like to be small and consumed by fear. I spoke of the nights the shouting in our house became a storm, forcing me outside to the back steps where our old dog would come and lean his solid weight against me until the thunder in my own chest finally subsided. I confessed how sometimes the simple grounding weight of his head on my knees was the only anchor keeping me from running off into the night. As I spoke, Leora's breathing began to steady. The violent tremors subsided into smaller, more distant shivers. Then came a long, shuddering sigh. At last she inched closer, rested her head directly upon my chest, and let out one profound, exhausted breath as if she'd finally set down her terror, if only for a moment. I kept talking, unearthing memories I hadn't given voice to in 50 years. I watched as her eyes drifted closed, and her body surrendered its full weight against me. By the time my wife peeked in, we were both there on the kitchen floor, one old man and one young dog intricately stitched together by the quiet histories of what we had survived. The next morning, with Leora dozing softly at my feet, the telephone's ring sliced through the peace. It was the shelter. The voice was gentle, but the tone was business. "What?" "Technically," they began, "she remains under our care. We're calling because we need to update her official status. Are you prepared to make a final decision on whether Leora is staying with you for good?" At 67, you don't really hold your breath for gifts under the tree. You're mostly just overcome with gratitude that the lights still flicker on and the coffee is hot. But that Christmas, the house felt charged with a new energy before a single person knocked. Leora padded from one room to the next, her nose curiously twitching at the tinsel, pausing with tense stillness by the window each time a car door slammed outside. When our daughter finally swept in with the grandkids, a whirlwind of coats and scarves and wonderful noise, they all froze in the doorway, their breath catching in the sudden silence. "Wow," our grandson whispered. "She's huge." Our daughter shot me that look, the one that holds a delicate balance of gentle concern and profound worry. "Are you certain you two can manage a German shepherd?" she asked, her voice hushed. "This is an enormous undertaking, Dad." But before I could form a reply, Leora moved with purpose toward the smallest of the children, who was clutching a soft, stuffed snowman. She lowered her great head, taking the toy from those tiny hands with the most deliberate, impossibly careful grip, then laid it back in the little girl's lap and gave a single slow wag as if to say, "I understand your language." Later, after the chaos subsided and the last dinner plate was dried, my wife settled into her favorite chair with a weary sigh. Unsummoned, Leora glided across the room and gently rested her head on my wife's knees, her breaths falling into a perfect rhythm with hers, as if she'd taken a silent vow to guard those tired bones. I sat near the hearth, and for the first time the stories I told that night felt lighter, stripped of their usual weight. The same passed the same years. But with Leora stretched out at my feet, a warm and grounding presence, she'd glance up each time my voice faltered, remaining steadfast until I could find it again. On the coffee table, beside a plate of half-eaten cookies, lay the unassuming stack of papers from the shelter. There was no grand legal battle, no soaring speeches, just a simple line for a signature that would bind Leora to us forever. We signed them in the glow of the fire, my own hand trembling more than I cared to admit. And as I put the pen down, my wife covered my hand with her own. We have no idea how many more Christmases this old house will see, but this one will be etched into our memory, not just for her, and not just for us, but perhaps for anyone watching who remembers the distant sound of a dog crying somewhere once. When a deep quiet finally descended upon the house, Leora curled into her bed by the fireplace, still adorned in the faded, red Christmas scarf the clinic had given her. The glow from the tree lights danced across her coat as I draped a small blanket over her back. She let out a soft sigh in her sleep, a single paw twitching as if she were finally chasing something wonderful in her dreams. And this entire quiet miracle unfolded all because we chose not to shut the window. That night we heard her cry. It can truly feel like your best days are a distant memory. I once believed the same thing until one bitter night when a puppy's cries cut through the falling snow. If you've seen my years, you understand how life compels you to slow down. Your back begins to argue with every move. Your knees declare their own intentions. And you start to think the world's great challenges should be passed to a younger generation. But to save someone smaller than you, youth is not a requirement. It simply requires a single moment where you stand firm and say, "Not while I'm here." Leora brought a new rhythm into our home, a new reason to draw back the curtains at dawn, to speak with a gentler voice in the mornings, and to laugh at the sight of her tripping over her own paws in a fit of joy. She filled a house that had grown profoundly silent with an undeniable warmth. And it all happened because we decided to listen, to truly listen, when it seemed no one else would. There are countless others just like her out there, cold and waiting, clinging to the hope that someone will hear them. Most of them are not waiting for a hero. They are just praying for one person who chooses not to turn away and pretend they heard nothing at all. Sharing these stories makes a bigger difference than you can possibly imagine. Every single time someone watches, likes, or shares a video like this one, its message travels to another soul. Maybe a person in your own town will hear a cry in the snow one night, and the memory of Leora will surface. Perhaps they will reach for the phone, or step out into the cold, or open their car door to make room for a life that had all but given up. We can all be quiet heroes. We don't need any capes. All we need is a willing heart, and those few precious moments where we choose empathy over our own ease. This small soul's journey from being discarded to being healed reveals the critical importance of non-profit rescue organizations. Caring for a rescued animal is more than affection. It is a profound responsibility. It is dedicated care. Come and join our Brave Paws family. Be the voice for the voiceless. Be their only hope.